Hi there, it's Kevin with the Rogue Market here for a top 10 video of cards that performed the best week 1 of War of the Spark. So in between week 1 and week 2. It's not even released on paper, but we have had a ton of tournaments between MTG Arena, MTGO, and I even looked at other sources where people have done major tournaments on like MTG Top 8 to compile this list I have in front of you. So these are going to be the top 10 cards that performed the best by the numbers, meaning the most copies in the most deck of this week number 0, week number 1 for War of the Spark. For this list, I did not include any rotating cards because I don't think you should invest in any rotating cards. Rotating cards only have a few months left before they're gone, and this is the time where you're going to be looking towards rotation. This is a good indicator of what cards are powerful enough to compete in a deep format like this one. There's only, one more set that's coming into this standard before it rotates, so therefore the power level of these cards are actually quite high in comparatively of what they need to be when sets rotate out. So they actually should see more play in theory after rotation because they'll even be more dominant. There are a few exceptions. Some of these are cards that get better with the more cards in the pool, but for the most part, this list has quite powerful cards that I think are going to perform quite well post-rotation. All right, so let's get into the list. Starting off at number 10 was God Eternal Kefnet. God Eternal Kefnet saw a lot of 1-ofs in the main and a bunch of 2-ofs in many Esper lists and Grixis lists in the sideboard. So God Eternal Kefnet is probably where it should be at the $17 mark. I think it actually has a little bit more to go down. There is just too much value in this set, and even though this is on my number 10, I think that it's just too rich at the $16 mark. People are talking about how this card's good enough for Modern. We'll have to wait and see if Modern lists do start incorporating it into their numbers. So you can look here, it's in Dimir control, Grixis control, and this Dimir invasion. So a lot of the Esper, Dimirs, and Grixises had good showings on week number 1, and I think this is what gets God Eternal Kefnet in this list, is just the amount of them that were in the sideboards of 2-ofs in the sideboard. All right, on to my number 9. Number 9 is Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord is another card that actually found its way in a lot of sideboards, and it was a splash card in some of the mono-white lists. So typically the mono-white lists have been splashing blue for Negate and Deputy of Detention. However, there are many decks that ran the Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord in the list instead. And we go down here, you see it's an Orzhov Knights, Orzhov Aristocrats, Abzan Midrange, and Esper Tempo. Esper Tempo, I believe, is going to be the hero of the one that spits out the tokens, so there's some good synergy there with Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord, and most of these decks actually stay intact post-rotation. So I'm really liking Sorin. The price point is actually probably about right at a $3 to $4 rare that sees, mostly it was just 2-ofs that this card saw in those deck lists. On to my number 8. Number 8 is a card that was very, very high on the first showing, the first list that we had available, but has kind of dropped out of favor because I think that people are going back to Risk Factor and Experimental Frenzy. And this is Chandra Fire Artisan. So Chandra Fire Artisan is one of the cards that I picked to go up in value. I think that the $2 is still quite low for this card. The problem with Chandra is both Experimental Frenzy and Risk Factor stick around post-rotation. So Chandra is fighting for that slot, and it really looks 50-50 at this point. There are a lot of decks that are running Chandra, but a lot of decks are running Risk Factor / Experimental Frenzy. It definitely has not solidified itself as a dominant piece in those decks. Where it does see a play is in either the Gruul Planeswalker decks or the mono red, kind of the big red Walker deck. So that's what Chandra has going for over those two. So I do think this card will continue to see play, but I don't know if it's going to see the dominant play that it saw in the first list as people figure out that Experimental Frenzy is better in spell-based decks where you can just go through multiple cards per turn, whereas you have to kind of wait for the Chandra Fire Artisan. This is typical of week number 1. People are experimenting with cards. So again, we don't know if this card is going to be able to stick around. So be careful with this card. However, it did see, like I said, a lot of play in the Gruul decks and there's a Sarka midrange. I don't know why it's not showing up in some of these mono red lists too that I found some copies in. On to my number, what are we under? Number 6 here is the Tamiyo Collector of Tales, or number 7, right? 10, 9, 8, 7, yeah. Tamiyo Collector of Tales. This was mainly because the Wilderness Reclamation decks had a very good showing, and Tamiyo Collector Tales seem to be a 3 of in all of the Wilderness Reclamation decks. There it is. There's some Wilderness Reclamation decks, so Tamiyo Collector Tales goes in that deck as it protects you against the discard, as well as you get to dig for your pieces. So Tamiyo Collector of Tales is probably right where it should be, around the $3 mark. In one deck is a 3 of. I think that is kind of the cap for War of the Spark at the moment. This set is going to be opened up like crazy, so be careful with these cards. Even though they're seeing a lot of play, they're very dominant. Wilderness Reclamation does actually stick around post-rotation because you don't need to be running the Nexus version. You still have like expansion to explosion. It does hurt to get rid of Search for Azcanta post-rotation, but they might be able to adjust without the card. And I think you just need Wilderness. As long as Wilderness Reclamation is in a format, it's going to be played. All right, so on to the next one. This is Legion Warboss. So Legion Warboss is both a switcheroo card, and it did actually have some decent showings in the main. What I mean by switcheroo is in the sideboard, people, especially like the Izzet decks or the Dimir decks or even Jeskai decks that are typically creatureless, they'll have 3 or 4 of Legion Warbosses in the sideboard, and then when your opponent takes out all the creature removal because you're running a creatureless deck, you swap in the Legion Warboss. So Legion Warboss saw a lot of those as the sideboard card, and it did actually see a number of decks in like these mono red aggro decks and the Gruul aggro decks. But for this week 1, it was a lot of these Jeskai control lists that it did cite it in from the sideboard as a way to combat people removing their creature removal. So I like Legion Warboss as an investable target. Be careful with this card because it was printed in the guild kits, and so the supply is actually quite high for the Legion Warboss. However, we've seen this card actually see play in Modern. We've seen it see play in even Legacy, so this is a good long-term investment for the Legion Warboss. Feels very similar to Goblin Rabble Master, and I think this trajectory is quite telling of where it's going to end up in 3, 4, 5 months, and then of course rotation. So very good investable target in the form of Legion Warboss. On to the next one, which is Deputy of Detention. Deputy Detention saw a good showing in a lot of the mono white splash blue decks. It was also in the Hero of Precinct 1 decks, and it seems to be there's quite a few Esper decks that were even running the Deputy of Detention. So it is very investable at this point. I like this card a lot. It actually sees play in Modern Humans, and Modern Spirits, it looks like. So this is probably the perfect card at the moment. I would assume that this sees play in Commander as well. Very, very good card to exile. Gets rid of a commander, gets rid of any problematic and non-land permanents, so any enchantment, any artifact. And yeah, I guarantee this is one of the more played cards from the Ravnica Allegiance in Commander. So this is a triple dipper for Deputy of Detention, and this price is just too low for the card. So I highly suggest investing in this. This is a good time period too, because Ravnica Allegiance is done being opened for drafting and sealed. So not any more supply is going to get injected into the system. Very, very low card for how much it sees play. And of course, keep your eye on this Humans. And most decks of Humans, there have been Deputy of Detentions, at least in the sideboard. So very, very good investable card. Now we're getting on to the really good stuff. There's a big jump between these first list and the next one. These are kind of the new pillars of the format, and it's really because Esper and Dimir had an amazing showing in this week 1. It was very dominant. One of the tournaments, one of the qualifiers was basically all blue-black decks, either Dimir or Esper in the list. So very dominant color pairing, and most of the cards out of those do not rotate. We still have all the kind of nuts and bolts for the shell of the deck. So the first one is Liliana Dreadhorde Champion. This was barely squeezed out by the next card we'll talk about. But Liliana Dreadhorde General, not Dreadhorde Champion, Liliana Dreadhorde General saw play as much as a 4 of in some decks, but it was all over the place. This is the card that I think has the best chance of going up, but I think that 25 is probably right for Liliana. I think Liliana is going to be the most expensive card in the War of the Spark. It's going to be the chase card for a long time to come, and 25 is probably the right price. You could invest in this card short term. I do think we're going to see a bump after the first major tournament if Liliana sees a good result there, and it could bump up to like 35 or 40, but I mean that window is going to be super narrow for you to get out of, and there's a lot of time there won't be a good spread or a buy list, or you won't have that time that you need to make those savvy trades or savvy sells and actually make profit on Liliana. So again, I like this. If you can find them for cheap, investing in this card and then hitting out at 25, using it as trade fodder, stuff like that. Again, it's just the supply and demand I think is perfect for this card. So for that reason, I'm not particularly targeting Liliana, Dreadhorde General, but keep in mind that it had an amazing showing. So if you look at all of these decks that it was in, Sultai Midrange, Esper Control, Orzhov Knights, Dimir Control, Rakdos Sacrifice, you get it. Just almost any deck that can run Liliana, either in the sideboard or in the main, feels very similar to how Vivian was with green decks. And black is much more powerful right now than green is. All right, so on to the next one that barely edged out Liliana was Enter the God Eternals. Now, this I think is a very good card to invest in because I think you can find copies of this for quite cheap. It is basically it's going to be Ravenous Chupacabra and Hostage Taker once those rotate. So this actually gets better once the rotation happens. I think that Sultai still has a pretty decent deck you can build. I know that Wild Growth Walker, you have to go away from that shell. But basically the mid-range, put out a green, roadblock and then followed up with good blue-black control is going to be a deck post-rotation. Esper is going to be a deck post-rotation. Grixis, Dimir, all those are really poised to be dominant post-rotation. And Enter the God Eternals is just a very good card at shutting down aggro and mid-range. It deals 4 damage to a creature and you gain life equal to damage dealt this way, and then you get a mass 4. So it's basically 3 things in one card. It is sorcery speed, so keep that in mind. It's a little more it's not as versatile as an instant, but still, with all that in one card, it is definitely a dominant card. And it saw a lot of play again. The Esper controls, a lot of them running 4 of Dimir Control, Dimir Invasion, Esper Tempo. A lot of these ran these. So, like I said, the hero of Precinct 1, kind of mid-range, go wide strategy was running this card as well. So, Enter the God Eternals, I think, just edged out Liliana because Liliana oftentimes was a 2 of. The average of this card was like 3 to 4 in the deck, and just a huge showing for the Enter the God Eternals. All right, so now there is another jump between the 3 and 4 card and the 1 and 2. The 1 and 2 are definitely the most dominant cards for this week 1. And I was actually wrong about this first card, and this is Teferi Time Raveler. I still don't like the price point of Teferi Time Raveler. I think that a $14 rare holding its price is quite wishful thinking. However, this card has seen Legacy play, so that's some food for thought. So Legacy, Modern, and Standard are all using the Teferi Time Raveler, and then Standard had a massive showing for this deck. It was basically because Esper Control is quite dominant, and it is being run in things like the Temur Reclamation, and in even all these other Esper Invasions, Esper Tempo, Blue-White Control, Bant Midrange. That's, again, Hero Precinct 1 decks are running the Teferi Time Raveler just because it allows you to get a card, eke out some card advantage for a 3-drop Planeswalker. So, I mean, that's not a bad ability for casting Teferi and immediately returning an artifact, creature, enchantment, and then drawing a card. So you're kind of bouncing a card, drawing a card, and then they still have to deal with the Planeswalker that then can start +1ing. If you're protected a few more turns, it's going to be bouncing those permanents again, and each opponent can only cast spells anytime they could cast a sorcery. Is amazing for basically any deck. Other control decks is great because you can fire off your things in your main and then keep up your instances in for their cards. And then for kind of the aggressive decks, like even the mono white decks that Splash and Deputy are also splashing Teferi because that shuts down a bunch of like Settle the Wreckage type board wipes, the instant speed ones where you don't have to worry about those and can swing in and not worry about Settle. So Teferi, I still think this is more around the $10 range just because of how much value is in War of the Spark. Keep in mind the F&M packs are going to have the Japanese alternate art at a high number, I believe. Like you have a 50% chance of getting one. Don't quote me on that. I need to reread it from the WPN, but they are going to be included in these F&M promo packs that stores get. And stores, they get like 10 per week. So I think that's going to actually add to a ton of supply of these type of cards. So careful about this card. I think $10 is the right price for this. It looks like market price is agreeing with me at the moment. All right, so on to my number 1, and this was by far the most dominant card, and it was another switcheroo, plus many decks actually put it in the main. This is Thief of Sanity. This is no surprise. Thief of Sanity saw a lot of play once the Sultai and Dimir decks started to gain a significant share of the meta. Thief of Sanity is a must-answer card. It uses your opponent's cards against them. It's not really a huge investment for a 2/2 for 2 mana that they have to remove. This is another card that people will swap in when your opponent sideboards out all of their creature removal, or at least it forces them to keep in their creature removal, or otherwise they just get beat by Thief of Sanity. So Thief of Sanity was everywhere in this week 1. So you can see the list that it actually made. It's actually being played in Legacy. That's Vintage even. So there's a really good indication of where Thief of Sanity is going to go. This could be the card that really should have called this one back in the... It just was... When I was playtesting with this card, there's just too much creature removal, too many lava coils and shocks running around in the format for Thief of Sanity, and then I gave up on the card, and then it really... It started to shine in that whole switcheroo strategy where in your Teferi decks, there's no creatures in it, you swap in Thief of Sanities, and yeah, just... If it's unanswered, it wins. So I think that what the main thing going for it, though, is that Legacy is actually picked it up, and this week 1 of Standard. So I do expect this to go up, but 5 is already pretty rich for a set that was opened as much as Guilds of Ravnica, which is rumored to be the most, well, at least pre-release. It had one of the better sales. Yeah, it might actually be the most sold set through its beginning of its life. I mean, it still has a lot of life left, so I'm sure that like Khans of Tarkir and Battle for Zendikar probably have more supply total. Probably even Dominaria has more total, but Guilds of Ravnica could be one of those sets that ends up being the most sold set of all time, either that between that and War of the Spark. So I don't typically like sets that have that. I mean, if you're looking for a card, a rare out of those particular sets, go look at Mantis Rider. Mantis Rider is a perfect example of a card that out of a huge supply set that is going nowhere because the supply is just through the roof. So look at Mantis Rider is in the number 1 deck in Modern at the moment, and it can't even crack a buck. So long term for Legacy, I don't know about Thief. For short term for Standard, $5 to $6 actually seems pretty right. So again, if I were to give you my top ones that I like, the 2 cards more than anything, it would be the Deputy of Detention and probably the Legion Warboss. I think those are quite undervalued cards. There are a few that barely didn't make this list. Let me just read them off real quick that were close. We had the Growth Chamber Champion. That was the next one up. We had Vivians that were close. Sarkon was close. Gideon, a hero of Precinct 1, just barely missed out. Ilharg actually had a good showing. And Oketra, believe it or not, had quite a few showings in the list. So there are some goodies here. The meta is still going to evolve over time. We haven't seen a major tournament yet, and I think that will have the most to do with the prices of these cards. If we come over here, War of the Spark is still on a free fall. Even all the cards that are seeing a lot of play, you can see cards like Tamiyo are bumping up because they have solidified a spot. But overall, this daily and weekly is mostly in the red here for cards. So not a very investable set at this point, even at cards that are seeing a lot. I'd wait till they bottom out and then look for the cards that are shining. And we'll keep updated for this, and especially keep looking at the cards that I think are going to do post-rotation. We always want to find those Jadelight Rangers. That's a great... The History of Benalia's Jadelight Rangers had a pretty good payday for me by investing in them after they bottomed out through their draft season, and then after they rotate, they're still seeing a ton of play of 4-ofs, and new players come in, and new players need them, and it causes the price to increase. So we'll be keeping our eye on those cards, especially from Ravnica Allegiance and Guilds of Ravnica. I think Ravnica Allegiance is the set that I really like for those particular cards. I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Kevin with the Rogue Market. Thanks for watching.